Okay, a brief introduction to Martin Luther. Martin Luther, born towards the end of the 15th century, he was a remarkable man who, under God, changed the course of European history, certainly, probably world history. He was born to ordinary parents, but quickly proved himself to be an excellent student and was sent by his father to Erfurt University at 18 to study law. He completed his degree and then his master's degree in 1505. Even then, at that early stage in his life, he excelled. He was an extraordinary student. Very, very clever man. His father, although a respected man in the community, wanted something significant from Martin, and so sending him to Erfurt University was a big thing. It was a big deal. It was a sacrifice for the family. It was a significant investment for them to put Martin through that. 1505, though, was a significant year for Luther. Not only did he get his master's degree, but he also had an experience that changed the course of his life. He was on the road back to Erfurt after visiting his parents and was caught in a thunderstorm. Lightning struck the ground near to him. He was so terrified by that experience of the lightning strike that he cried out to the family saint, St. Anne, "St. Anne, help me, I will become a monk." I don't suppose that's the kind of prayer that you offer up most evenings, but that's what Martin Luther offered up as he faced sudden death out in that field as he was riding to Erfurt. As a Roman Catholic, the prospect of sudden death without confession was a terrifying prospect. Unconfessed sin, of course, meant time in purgatory. Nonsense, but that was so firmly implanted on Martin Luther's conscience that the thought that he would be struck down without chance to confess was terrifying. Help me, St. Anne, I will become a monk. And Martin Luther was a conscientious man, so he fulfilled that vow. He sold his books, much to his father's annoyance. I'm just beginning to understand that, really, how much we invest in our children and want them to do certain things. His father was furious with Martin for selling those books and leaving the life of law. But he did. He sold them, became a monk, and he went to live in the Augustinian monastery at Erfurt. As a monk, Luther was devout. He prayed, he fasted, he went without sleep, he confessed his sin obsessively. In fact, so much that Baron von Staupitz, who was his spiritual mentor, despaired of the confession of Martin Luther. Martin Luther didn't just confess for 5 or 10 minutes each day. He would go in for hours confessing every single thing he could possibly think. So Staupitz, in the end, decided that the best thing for this enthusiastic, very able young monk was to send him to Wittenberg University. In God's kindness, that was the very best thing that could happen to Luther, because it meant, instead of simply accepting the things that his Roman Catholic mentors were teaching him, he was brought face to face with the Bible. Isn't that remarkable? He was brought face to face with the Bible as a student and then a professor at Wittenberg University. At Wittenberg, he did 3 more degrees before eventually becoming a doctor of theology and assuming the role of head of theology in the university in 1512, not at 1512, 3:15. 1512, he became the chair of theology, the doctor of theology in Wittenberg University. He was there for 4 years as the doctor of theology, lecturing on Psalms, Hebrews, Galatians, and Romans. And this is where he really began to wrestle with this idea of justification. How can you be right with God? Because at the heart of it, that is the issue of justification. Whatever else I say tonight, whatever else you hear about justification, that is the heart of the issue. How can I, a sinful person, be just, be right before God? That was the issue for Martin Luther. Now, there is some debate amongst scholars about what year Martin Luther actually became a Christian. Many reckon it 1513, but Martin Luther himself, who I think knew a little bit about what was going on in his life, said it was 1519. He was reading and he was studying Romans, and he began to see something that he had not seen before. And this is what he says in his own words. "At last, meditating day and night by the mercy of God, I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that through which the righteous live by a gift of God, namely by faith. Here I felt as if I was entirely born again and had entered paradise itself through the gates that had been flung open. The Bible changed Martin Luther. Now, what an encouragement to people who have committed their lives to teaching the Bible. The Bible did the job. The Bible convinced Martin Luther that justification was a gift. We'll come back to that in a moment. Famously, 500 years ago, hence this celebration in 2017. In 1517, so probably pre-conversion, Luther posted a document of 95 theses or statements about the errors that he saw in the theology of the church of his day. It was prompted particularly by the selling of indulgences. If you don't know what that's about, essentially the idea was that you could get your relatives or friends off purgatory for a certain number of years by giving money to the church. There were other things you could do, but it was particularly that giving of money to the church that so infuriated Luther. It was just so anti-Bible as far as he could see. The selling of these indulgences was to fund the activities of the church, but 50% of the indulgences sold, 50% of the monies raised went to the building of St. Peter's Basilica. That's a lot of money. But it wasn't just the money that was the issue for Luther. He saw the way that the Roman Catholic Church, his church, were teaching the gospel in a false way and usurping the authority of Christ. Those 95 theses were an invitation to debate and discuss within the academic community. The way that you prompted a discussion in those days was that you would write something in Latin, you would nail it to the door so that the educated people could read it, and then you'd have the debate. This wasn't Martin Luther speaking to the world, this was Martin Luther speaking to the other educated people of his day. But I think to his annoyance at first, it was translated into German, within 2 weeks spread all over Germany, and then was printed and within 2 months had spread all over Europe. And that's when things really kicked off. The issue was out in the open, and the Pope couldn't ignore it. Luther was summoned to a hearing in 1518, which didn't end well, Luther slipping out of the city where it took place. And then there followed another attempt to silence him and his ideas in 1519, but that too failed. And then the Pope excommunicated him in 1521. He was ordered to appear before a legal council at Worms in April of 1521, and he was asked at that council if he stood by all the things he had written about the Bible and about the Pope and about the false practices as he saw them going on in the church. There was some toing and froing, but eventually we get this famous statement, this reply from Luther. Unless I'm convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust either in the Pope or in councils alone, since it's well known that they've often erred and contradicted themselves. That's fairly inflammatory, isn't it? I'm bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me. After much deliberation, the assembly, which was headed by Emperor Charles V, gave the Edict of Worms, which made Martin Luther an outlaw. It banned his writings, made him the subject of an arrest warrant. It was against the law to give Martin Luther food or drink, and anyone could legally kill him. Now, if you don't know the story as it unfolds from there, I hope that whets your appetite to buy a Luther biography. It's a cracking story. I ought to just say that while I've got tremendous respect for him, he did do some, well, in theology we would call them technically crazy things. He did some crazy things and had some crazy ideas, but much of what Luther did was wonderful, and we are so grateful to God for what he did through Martin Luther for the church. Probably the most significant thing that Martin Luther helped us to see is the importance of the doctrine of justification by faith alone. So let me just turn you to the verse that actually changed him, the Bible section that changed him, and let me give you an explanation of what Luther saw and then some practical, and I think probably the most important application of this doctrine of justification. So here's the verse. It's Romans 1:16 and 17, 2 verses. This is how it reads. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Let me start with a little bit of exegesis, a little bit of explanation. First, Paul, who writes this, is really keen to come and preach in Rome for 2 key reasons. Number one, he wants to preach the gospel in Rome because it saves people. The good news saves people. And number 2, he wants to preach in Rome because it is absolutely for everyone. Without exception, the good news saves people, and it is for everyone. Now, we need to get that in our heads so that we don't think that people can be saved by any other way than the good news about Jesus' death and resurrection. I'd be surprised at such an august gathering as this if there was anybody in the room who wasn't convinced of that. But that idea is under attack so often in church history and so often in our own day that we want to be absolutely convinced of this and firm on this. There is no other way to be saved except through the gospel about Jesus Christ. That's the only way you get saved. Secondly, Paul is really clear here that the people who are saved by this gospel are those who believe it. Not simply intellectually accept it, but those who stake everything on it. Faith is not simply understanding. Faith is putting your trust in it. It is relying on it. It is putting all your eggs in the one gospel basket. It's staking everything on that claim of who Jesus is and what he did. Thirdly, Paul says it's good news because it shows us God's righteousness. It reveals his righteousness in some way. Fourthly, Paul says that those who are righteous are those who have faith. This is really important. Those who are righteous are those who have faith, and so they live. Now, to unpack that a little bit, I need to explain Martin Luther's struggle, and that will help you to see why this verse was absolute dynamite to this man. First, let's talk about God's righteousness and try and define that, shall we, between us? When I say righteousness of God, just that phrase, righteousness of God, I wonder what comes into your mind. What do you think about? What words would you substitute? Goodness, perhaps. Or moral purity. Or rightness, because that's the root of the word in English at least. Righteousness is rightness. Straightness. Let me read you what Martin Luther thought of the righteousness of God. You might be shocked by this. I hated that word. Martin Luther hated the word, the righteousness of God. I hated that word, the righteousness of God, by which I had been taught, according to the custom and use of all teachers, that God is righteous and punishes the unrighteous sinner. Practically, what does that mean? It meant Martin Luther knew that even though he tried to be the most devout and conscientious monk that he could, although he rose from bed at 3 a.m. every morning in order to read and pray and fast, although he had been meticulous about confessing each and every sin he could recall, he still knew that he could never, ever stand before a righteous and holy God. The thought of a God who is holy and perfect and just and who dwells in inaccessible light was unbearable for Luther, the monk. Unbearable. Isn't that strange? A man who is religious and devout and yet who hates the idea of the righteousness of God. And yet understanding that phrase, the righteousness of God, correctly is absolutely essential to understanding the gospel. So what does it mean? What does it mean, the righteousness of God, particularly in Romans? which is what we're looking at. What does it mean, the righteousness of God? What is the righteousness of God? Well, let's start with the Old Testament, because Romans didn't just fall out of heaven on its own. It comes from a whole rich heritage of thinking in the Old Testament. What does the phrase righteousness of God mean in the Old Testament? It's all right, I'm going to save you Hebrew tonight. You don't need to do any of that with me. But this is quite an eye-opener. If you work through the Old Testament and you look at that phrase, the righteousness of God, the overwhelming use of that phrase is to describe God in his saving activity. Isn't that surprising? The righteousness of God in the Old Testament overwhelmingly is used in connection with God's saving work. He is righteous because he is a saving God. It's a wonderful revelation of the character of God. God is just and holy, of that there is no doubt, but his righteousness, his rightness, his justice is seen in the way that he saves people. God is seen to be righteous. He is faithful, just, glorious, because he saves. Now, please don't get the impression that that means that God is not serious about sin. Of course God is serious about sin. He opposes it, absolutely. He is passionately opposed to all evil, and his commitment to dealing with sin is so complete that he will punish eternally those who unrepentantly persist in sin. Make no mistake, God will deal eternally with those who persist in sin. His righteousness is not compromised by his saving activity. His righteousness is seen to be complete and divine in the way that he both punishes sin in himself at the cross and rescues sinners by transferring their sin onto Christ. But there is one more step, and this is the heart of the doctrine of justification. Justification is not just about God's saving activity. The righteousness of God is secondly and crucially about a gift of righteousness that comes from God. That's what's revealed in the gospel. That's the mystery unfolded, that God gifts righteousness to people. And that's what absolutely blew Luther away. The righteousness of God is not something that he keeps to himself. It's something that in Christ he gifts to those who believe. Justification is about God declaring that we are right, we are good, because he gives us the gift of righteousness. In that way, righteousness is not something we do or even something that God does inside us. Righteousness is a gift that God confers on us by declaring us right through Jesus. And the way that we accept that gift of righteousness is by faith. We believe, we trust him, and we accept the gift. Faith is the open hand that receives the gift. Faith and righteousness are so closely linked in the book of Romans that when Paul talks about righteousness, it's rare, if ever, that he doesn't mention the word faith. They're so intimately linked in this great letter. Righteousness comes by faith. That is the way that righteousness comes to us. Right, I know it is 8:31 and some of us have had a long journey already today, but I'm going to read you some 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. Can you cope with that? Great. I thought I'd pick the right thing for this crowd. Here we go. Those whom God effectually calls, he also freely justifies, not by infusing righteousness into them, putting it inside us, but by pardoning their sins and by accounting and accepting their persons as righteous, not for anything wrought in them or done by them, but for Christ's sake alone. Not by imputing faith, the act of believing, or any other evangelical obedience to them as their righteousness, but by imputing, and here it is, Christ's active obedience unto the whole law and his passive obedience in his death for their whole and sole righteousness by faith, which faith they have, not of themselves, it is the gift of God. Now that is cracking. That is absolutely great. In those very old words, do you see how justification is all about God declaring us to be righteous by giving us the obedience of Christ? That is the heart of justification. Justification is the imputing of all of Christ's obedience, active and passive, active in his life as he lives, perfectly obedient to the Father in every way. He credits that to us, but also his obedience passively at the cross as he dies to expiate our sins, to take away our sins. Credited to us, all of it. And that's great. Even at 8:30 on a Tuesday night, we should be excited about that. That is good news. Taking that all together, that means that God's righteousness is seen in the work of him declaring sinners right by giving them his own righteousness. Now that is very exciting. Righteousness then ceases to be this terrifying vision of a holy God who wants to rain down judgment on us, and it is seen in righteousness that he gifts to us. That's justification. Righteousness is a gift that comes from outside. It's not worked up in us or achieved by us in any way. So let's go back to Luther and see how that worked out. Luther hates the idea that God is just and holy and right because it simply makes him feel how sinful he really is. That idea condemns him. But then he reads Romans, and actually he reads Augustine's commentary on Romans. So Martin Luther, 1500 and something, Augustine of Hippo, 400 and something, sort of 1100 years earlier. He was writing about justification. He hadn't seen the whole picture, but he'd seen enough to know that it was a gift. Martin Luther reads this and goes, wow, that's my German translation. Wow, this is amazing. It's a gift. It's not something terrifying, it's a gift. And this is how Luther translates the verse. Of course, this is English, but sort of quite a literal translation of his German. The one who is righteous by faith will live. Now, it took me a long time to understand that. I just thought, well, he's just messing around with the word order. What on earth's going on there? But just hear it again. The one who is righteous by faith will live. How are we made righteous? That's the key question. How do I get right with God? How can I ever be good enough for God when the standard is perfection? The answer is faith. He who is righteous by faith. It is those who are righteous through faith that live, not those who become righteous by effort or by religion. It is those who are trusting God. I think it's John Calvin who says, I can't remember exactly, I'm pretty sure it's John Calvin who says that faith is best described as a cup, an empty cup that we hold up and we say, I need your gift. So faith isn't a work, it's an empty vessel. It's the whole, please, I need you. We come to God to receive the gift of righteousness. We hold up the cup, he fills it. Faith is not some extra thing we do. It's simply trusting him and receiving the gift. Now, here we go. How long has that taken me? But I've got to the application now. Here we go. This is the application. And it's only one application, but it will take me 40 minutes to do it. I'm joking. I had a conversation the other day with someone, I can't remember who it was, about the way that so many of the testimonies that we hear today, that I hear today about people becoming a Christian, seem completely lacking in any description of feeling the weight of sin and the need of forgiveness. I well understand that God gets hold of people in different ways, and conversion is not always as neat as we would like it to be. But it does worry me, the sheer number of testimonies that don't talk about conviction of sin and the need for forgiveness. That worries me. It worries me that we may be doing a bad job of presenting the good news in such a way that we underplay God's burning anger against sin. Even in the very next verse of Romans, Paul talks about God's wrath being revealed from heaven against our ungodliness and unrighteousness. Martin Luther, in his writings, uses a very difficult to translate word to describe his spiritual struggles. Anfechtung, the German word, sometimes translated as soul anguish, attack, challenge, trial, temptation, appeal, opposition, all of those words sort of work for that German word. When Luther used that word, he was describing a number of different things through his life. He used that word a number of times. But during this part of his life, when he was a monk, it describes that struggle between understanding that God is perfectly just and holy, burningly holy, and we are black and broken and sinful and ruined. And we've got no way of bridging that gap. There is nothing we can do to bridge that gap. And believe me, he tried. He tried a jolly sight better than most of us do. He tried, but he could not do it. Into that problem, the gospel of justification by faith alone was a wonderful and true answer. And here it is. The first and most wonderful application of the doctrine of justification is for non-Christians, and it is the fact that we are saved not based on what we do or have done or could do. It is completely based on what Jesus does. Completely based on what Jesus does. Let me give you a few examples to sort of nail that down. Imagine a man who has lived his life in a obviously sinful way. He's done the things that other people have done around him. He's slept around. He's partied hard. He's taken drugs. He's perhaps been involved in situations that even some of his friends would find shocking. And then he comes face to face with the truth that there is a God who is holy and powerful, and before whom he must appear one day and give an account of his life. He's terrified. He hasn't lived a good life. There is no hope of balancing out the scales by seeing what good he can offer. This person knows that he is bad and that it's game over as far as Judgment Day is concerned because he has got no answer. How does the doctrine of justification help that person? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? It is the answer. It is absolutely the answer. Imagine you met that person and he said to you, I am terrified that I've got to stand before God one day and I don't know what to do. What would you say to him? Well, you could say something like this: God knows all about what you've done. Even better than you do, he knows what you've done. And he's offering you a gift. He will declare you innocent, righteous, accepted, if only you will trust him to do that. Isn't that great? And then he'll say to you, how on earth can that happen? Surely that's unjust. I mean, that's just not fair. And you will reply, not at all, because Jesus will take your sin on himself, he will pay for it at the cross, and he will credit to your account all of his goodness. That's the transaction, that's the gift. He will take it, the bad, he will give it, his obedience, and you will stand justified. If you will only trust him. Do you see how that's wonderfully good news? No matter how bad you are and how messed up you have become, the doctrine of justification tells you that you can be declared righteous, good, just, because God will deal with it. He will take your sin and he will give you Christ's righteousness as a gift. That is the revelation, the righteousness of God revealed in the gospel. He will give you the goodness of Christ. How bad is too bad? Well, the question is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant, isn't it? It's about how good is Jesus. That is the question. Not how bad are you. It's about how good is Jesus. Now imagine a second case. Imagine a woman who has worked really hard all of her life to do what is right. She's raised her family sacrificially. She's put in the effort at work and gone the extra mile. She's even gone to church and worked through all the religious exercises and disciplines that her denomination practices. And yet she feels a million miles away from God. She feels that God is so far above her in holiness that the thought of him actually terrifies her. What would you say to her if she came to ask you for advice? Well, you might say something like this. You might say, the great news is that God knows just how far short you really are. And even if everybody else thinks you're good, the answer is he knows and will give you goodness that you've never had as a gift. He will declare you innocent, righteous, good by taking your sin and giving you the righteousness of Christ. Now, in some way, those two cases are a bit like two of my favourite Christians from history. Augustine, I mentioned him, Augustine of Hippo. He lived the life, really. He had a girlfriend, had a son out of wedlock, a Deodatus, and got up to some pretty raucous stuff. I mean, it wasn't just stealing apples. I know he talks about that in the Confessions, but he did some other stuff as well, living the life. That was Augustine. And then God showed him in the end that that life, as bad as it was forgiven and dealt with in Christ. He was justified by faith. He understood that. Christ's work was enough to cover all of that. And then we get Martin Luther, who was so devout and so serious about following, and yet felt crushed by the righteousness of God until he understood that God's righteousness was a gift that he could have by faith, and so he was saved. Do you understand now why he would not give that up when the Pope threatened him with all sorts of things? I'm not giving that up, says Martin Luther. I've only just discovered it. This is righteousness by faith. And you want me to deny that? That's good news, I think. And the doctrine of justification is not a dry and irrelevant idea that has nothing to do with me. It is, first of all, it is the message that we're going to take to the world, isn't it? We tell them that is the good news. God's righteousness will be gifted to you by faith. Trust him. Believe in him.